Ainsley Morgan, 28, stood frozen in her apartment, staring at her phone. The Forbes notification illuminated her tear-stained face. 30 under 30. Media list announced. Her name was there right on the screen for the podcast empire she'd built alone. The same hobby her parents had refused to acknowledge just 8 months earlier when they skipped her launch party, claiming real careers didn't involve just talking into microphones. Before I dive into how my parents' dismissal of my dreams led to the sweetest revenge story of my life, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop your location in the comments and hit that subscribe button if you've ever had someone underestimate your potential. This family revenge drama might just give you the courage to prove your own doubters wrong. Now let's get into how my parents' rejection became the fuel for my biggest success. The tension with my parents started long before Forbes ever knew my name. I grew up in a household where expectations were as rigid as the frames that held my father's law degree and my mother's medical license on our living room wall. The Morgan family legacy was built on traditional success, prestigious universities, conventional career paths, and the kind of stability that comes with a 401k and health benefits. My childhood in suburban Connecticut was comfortable but constrained. Dinner conversations revolved around my parents' professional achievements, their colleagues' promotions, and their not-so-subtle hints about which prep schools would best position me for an Ivy League future. When I brought home straight A's, the praise was perfunctory. It was expected, not exceptional. The unspoken family motto seemed to be, "Excellence is our baseline, not our goal." I followed their carefully constructed path dutifully through high school, maintaining my position as class valedictorian and securing my spot at Yale. My parents threw an elaborate graduation party, inviting their entire social circle to witness their parenting success. Ainsley is going to study economics, my father announced proudly to anyone who would listen, though we had never actually discussed my major. I smiled through gritted teeth, already feeling the invisible chains tightening. College became my first taste of rebellion. While I did major in economics to appease my parents, I also discovered the campus radio station. Something about sitting behind that microphone felt like coming home. I started with a small weekly show discussing campus events, but soon expanded to interviewing local entrepreneurs. The station manager noticed my natural interviewing style and gave me additional time slots. When my parents visited campus, I excitedly invited them to the studio. "It's just an extracurricular, right?" my mother asked dismissively. "Make sure it doesn't interfere with your studies." They never once tuned in to my broadcasts, not even when I interviewed the university president, a coup that earned me recognition from the communications department. After graduation, I accepted a position at a prestigious consulting firm in New York, exactly as expected. The job came with everything my parents valued: status, security, and a clear advancement path. My apartment in Manhattan impressed them, as did my business cards and expense account. For 2 years, I lived the life they had scripted for me, excelling at a job that left me feeling hollow. The turning point came during a client meeting, when I was tasked with helping a media company restructure their content strategy. As they described their struggling podcast division, I found myself offering suggestions that went far beyond financial optimization. My insights into audience engagement and content development surprised even me, drawing on knowledge I'd gained from my college radio days and the podcasts I devoured during my subway commutes. "You should be working in content creation, not analyzing spreadsheets about it," the client's media director told me afterward. Her words echoed in my mind for weeks. Meanwhile, my parents were thrilled when I received a promotion, celebrating with an expensive dinner where they toasted the next partner in the making. I smiled and raised my glass, but the champagne tasted bitter. The idea for my own podcast began as notes jotted down during lunch breaks, interviews with women who had walked away from traditional success to pursue unconventional passions. I called it Detoured, focusing on the messy, beautiful reality of career pivots. Using my savings, I invested in quality equipment and converted my walk-in closet into a makeshift recording studio. My first 3 episodes, recorded on weekends and late nights, featured a former investment banker who now ran a sustainable farm, a lawyer who became a celebrated pastry chef, and a teacher who developed a successful education app. The download numbers were modest but growing, and the feedback was enthusiastically positive. When I finally worked up the courage to tell my parents about my side project, I expected at least polite interest. Instead, my father's face clouded over and my mother set down her fork with a pointed clink against the plate. A podcast. That's what all those late nights at the office were for. My father's voice was quiet but cutting. Anyone with a microphone thinks they're a broadcaster these days. It's actually doing quite well, I defended, explaining my growing audience and the positive reviews. I'm thinking about taking it more seriously. My mother reached across the table to pat my hand condescendingly. Hobbies are important, sweetheart, but let's not confuse them with career advancement. I left their apartment that night with their dismissal burning in my chest, more determined than ever to prove that my voice and the voices of my guests deserved to be heard. What I didn't realize was that this was just the beginning of a family betrayal that would ultimately force me to choose between my parents' approval and my own authenticity. The final straw came 6 months after launching my podcast. I had been living a double life, consulting by day, podcasting by night, and the exhaustion was taking its toll. My boss had noticed my declining enthusiasm. My parents kept pressuring me about focusing on what matters, and I felt constantly torn between obligation and passion. Something had to give. After much soul-searching and budget calculations, I made my decision. I had saved enough for a 1-year runway, and my podcast had grown to 15,000 weekly listeners, modest but promising. Sponsorship inquiries were starting to come in, and I had a vision for expanding into a network of shows centered around career reinvention stories. I drafted my resignation letter on a Sunday and scheduled a dinner with my parents the same day. The plan was to tell them first, hoping that presenting my detailed business plan would help them understand this wasn't a whim, but a calculated risk. I prepared a portfolio showing listener growth, revenue projections, and potential partnerships. This wasn't just about following my passion, though. That mattered deeply. It was about recognizing a viable business opportunity in the growing podcast market. The restaurant I chose was their favorite Italian place where celebrations had marked family milestones throughout my childhood. I arrived early, nervously arranging my presentation materials at our table. When they walked in, I stood to greet them with hugs, trying to ignore the knot in my stomach. After ordering, I took a deep breath. Mom, Dad, I've made an important decision that I wanted to share with you first. Their expression shifted from casual interest to alertness. I'm leaving consulting to focus full-time on Detoured and expanding it into a podcast network. The silence that followed seemed to stretch for an eternity before my father laughed. Actually laughed, as if I'd told a particularly absurd joke. You can't be serious. I am serious. I pushed my business plan across the table. I've done the research. The podcast market is growing exponentially, and I've identified a specific niche with limited competition. My listener base is already substantial, and I have 3 sponsors lined up. My mother didn't even glance at the materials. Ainsley, this is ridiculous. You went to Yale. You have a position at one of the most prestigious firms in New York. And you want to throw it all away to talk into a microphone in your closet. It's more than that. It's irresponsible. My father cut in, his voice hardening. We didn't invest in your education for you to become some internet personality. This isn't a real career. Digital media is absolutely a real industry, I countered, feeling my cheeks flush. The podcast advertising market alone is projected to exceed $1 billion this year. And how much of that billion will be yours? My mother asked skeptically. Be realistic, Ainsley. For every successful podcast, there are thousands that fail. I had anticipated resistance, but not this level of dismissal. I'm not asking for your financial support. I've saved enough to give this a real shot. I'm just asking for your emotional support. My father pushed away my business plan without having read a word. We support you making responsible choices. This isn't one. The remainder of dinner passed in uncomfortable conversation about safer topics: my cousin's new baby, their upcoming anniversary trip. They pointedly avoided any mention of my announcement, as if by ignoring it they could make it disappear. When the bill came, my father insisted on paying a final reminder of the financial security I was walking away from. Outside the restaurant, my mother hugged me tightly. Think this through, please. Take a sabbatical if you need a break, but don't burn bridges. I nodded noncommittally, already knowing my mind was made up. The next morning, I submitted my resignation letter and announced my departure date 2 weeks later. My colleagues were surprised but largely supportive, many admitting they had side projects they dreamed of pursuing. My boss, while disappointed to lose me, offered to be a future resource if I ever wanted to return. The contrast between my workplace's reaction and my parents' dismissal couldn't have been starker. I threw myself into preparations for my podcast launch event, renting a small event space in Brooklyn, where I planned to record a live episode with a panel of successful career changers, followed by a networking reception. I sent formal invitations to everyone in my circle, including my parents, highlighting it as my official entry into entrepreneurship. 3 days before the event, my mother called. Dad and I were looking at our calendar and we have a conflict on Thursday night. Dr. Winters is hosting a fundraiser that we really shouldn't miss. The Dr. Winters she referred to was a casual acquaintance at best, someone they had mentioned maybe twice before. The excuse was as transparent as it was hurtful. I understand, I replied flatly, not wanting to give them the satisfaction of hearing my disappointment. We'll catch the next one, she added cheerfully, as if this were a recurring neighborhood barbecue and not the pivotal moment of my career change. Maybe you can record it for us. I hung up, feeling a strange mix of grief and determination. My launch event would happen without my parents, without their blessing, without even their curiosity. What I didn't realize then was that their absence would become the catalyst for a series of events that would transform not only my career, but our entire family dynamic. The launch event for Detoured exceeded all my expectations, except for the 2 empty seats in the front row that I had reserved with mom and dad place cards. I had held out hope until the last minute that they might change their minds, that their absence was a bluff meant to scare me back to consulting. As the room filled with supportive friends, former colleagues, and even a few loyal listeners from my early episodes, those empty seats seemed to grow more conspicuous. My featured guests, a former Wall Street executive turned sustainable fashion designer, a corporate lawyer who now ran a successful bakery, and a tech executive who left Silicon Valley to establish a digital nomad community, all shared stories of facing skepticism from loved ones. The irony wasn't lost on me or my audience. The hardest part wasn't leaving my 6-figure salary the former lawyer shared during our panel. It was disappointing people who had specific dreams for me that didn't align with my own. The knowing murmurs from the audience made me realize how universal this struggle was. After the recording ended to enthusiastic applause, the networking portion began. 3 different media outlets covered the event, and a representative from a mid-sized podcast network approached me about potential collaboration. As I mingled accepting congratulations and exchanging business cards, I kept glancing at the entrance part of me, still childishly hoping my parents might make a surprise appearance. They didn't. Instead, I received a text from my mother around 10 p.m. Hope your podcast thing went well. The fundraiser ran late. Call tomorrow. The dismissive phrasing podcast thing stung more than their absence. I didn't call the next day. Or the day after. For the first time in my life, I created distance, focusing instead on the post-launch momentum. Download numbers for the live episode tripled my previous average. 2 new sponsors reached out, and a journalist from a digital media blog requested an interview about Detoured and its focus on career transitions. When I finally answered my mother's call a week later, her first question was, "Are you still going through with this podcast phase?" Not asking about the event, not acknowledging my radio silence, just immediately questioning the legitimacy of my choice. "It's not a phase, Mom." The launch was incredibly successful. I tried to keep my voice neutral, professional even. We had media coverage and interest from a distribution network. "That's nice, dear." Her tone suggested she was humoring me. "Your father and I were talking, and we think you should consider applying for a position at Henley Stevens. Your father's colleague's son is a partner there, and they value consultants with your background." The casual way she tried to redirect my career path, completely disregarding my current pursuit, unleashed something in me. I don't want a position at Henley Stevens. I don't want any consulting position. I am building something meaningful, something that resonates with people, and I'm good at it. "Don't use that tone with me," she replied, her voice cooling. "We're thinking about your future." "No, you're thinking about the future you want for me, which isn't the same thing. You and Dad couldn't even be bothered to attend my launch, the most important professional milestone of my life so far, because it didn't fit your narrow definition of success. Ainsley, be reasonable. We had a prior commitment to a fundraiser hosted by someone you barely know." The words tumbled out before I could censor them. "You prioritized maintaining appearances over supporting your daughter. At least be honest about that." The silence that followed was deafening. Finally, my mother spoke in a carefully controlled voice. "I think you need some time to reflect on your attitude. Call us when you're ready to have a constructive conversation." She hung up before I could respond, leaving me seething. That evening, I poured my frustration into writing the outline for a special episode of Detoured, focused specifically on parental expectations and the courage to defy them. I put out a call for listener stories and was overwhelmed by the response. Hundreds of emails flooded in with personal accounts of similar struggles. 2 weeks passed without contact from either parent. I immersed myself in work, expanding Detoured from 1 weekly episode to 3 each, focusing on different aspects of career transitions. The audience grew steadily, and the podcast began generating enough revenue to cover my basic expenses. For the first time, I allowed myself to believe this could be sustainable. Then came the email from my father, brief and pointed. "Your mother and I are concerned about this continued rebellion. The Morgans have built a reputation for excellence and stability. Your grandfather established a legacy that we've all worked hard to uphold. This podcast venture reflects poorly on the family name. We're asking you to reconsider before you damage your professional reputation irreparably." The message contained no questions about my well-being, no interest in my project's progress, just concern about the family reputation. I read it multiple times, each reading revealing the conditional nature of their support, available only when I conform to their expectations. I didn't reply immediately. Instead, I channeled my hurt into a particularly powerful episode featuring an interview with a psychologist who specialized in adult children of achievement-oriented parents. Without sharing my specific situation, I crafted questions that allowed us to explore the dynamics of families where love seemed tied to external success markers. The episode resonated deeply with listeners. Comments poured in from people sharing similar experiences, and subscription numbers jumped significantly. A producer from a national radio program reached out about featuring segments of Detoured in a special series on the changing landscape of career fulfillment. 3 days after my father's email, I finally responded, "I respect the Morgan legacy of excellence, which is precisely why I'm pursuing excellence in my chosen field. My podcast isn't a rebellion, it's a business with growing audience and revenue. I'd like to share this journey with you, but I can't and won't abandon it to preserve appearances. The door is open when you're ready to see what I'm actually building, not just what you fear I'm destroying." His response was a single line: "Your mother and I are taking some time to process your choices." That time stretched into months of minimal contact, obligatory birthday calls, brief holiday greetings, but nothing substantive. I stopped sharing my professional milestones with them after my excitement about securing a major sponsor was met with my mother's tepid response: "That's nice, but Johnson & Williams is still hiring if you come to your senses." The estrangement hurt deeply, but alongside the pain came an unexpected freedom. Without seeking their approval, I made bolder decisions for Detoured, expanding into new formats and topics that might have seemed too risky under their scrutinizing gaze. The podcast grew steadily, eventually necessitating a small team, a research assistant, a sound engineer, and a part-time social media manager. 6 months after the launch event, they skipped. I signed a distribution deal with one of the largest podcast networks in the industry. The press release announcing the partnership described Detoured as a fresh voice in the evolving conversation about career fulfillment and authentic success. I didn't send the article to my parents. The silence between us had become its own kind of statement, painful but increasingly familiar. What I didn't realize was that this estrangement, difficult as it was setting the stage for a reckoning none of us could have anticipated, one that would force us all to confront the true meaning of success, family, and loyalty. 7 months into my new career, Detoured had evolved from a solo passion project into a respectable media brand. We had expanded to include a YouTube channel where we shared visual components of interviews, a newsletter with over 5,000 subscribers, and a membership community for career transitioners, supporting each other through their journeys. I had moved operations from my bedroom closet to a small but legitimate studio space in Brooklyn, where my team of 5 now worked. The podcast itself had grown to include 3 distinct shows under the Detoured Media umbrella: the original interview series, now called Detoured The Conversations, a practical advice show called The Pivot Playbook, and a new series featuring anonymous confessions from people contemplating major career changes titled Before I Jump. Our listenership had climbed to over 1,000,000 weekly downloads across all shows, and we'd secured partnerships with several major brands that aligned with our values. I was busy, fulfilled, and building something meaningful, all without a word of acknowledgement from my parents. Our communication had dwindled to perfunctory texts and occasional family obligation calls. I had stopped trying to explain my success to them after one particularly painful phone conversation, where my mother had changed the subject from my first 6-figure sponsorship deal to my cousin's new position at a law firm. The Forbes nomination came completely by surprise. A journalist had featured Detoured in an article about innovative media startups several months earlier, which apparently caught the attention of the Forbes editorial team. Their email requesting information for their 30 under 30 consideration sent me into a spiral of disbelief and elation. Even being nominated seemed surreal. This was validation from an institution my parents actually respected. I submitted the requested materials, but downplayed the possibility in my mind. Thousands of media entrepreneurs were considered each year, and my operation, while growing impressively, was still relatively small. I told no one about the nomination, not wanting to face potential disappointment publicly. The morning the list was announced, I was in the middle of recording a segment when my phone began buzzing incessantly with notifications. My social media manager burst into the studio, interrupting the session with uncharacteristic urgency. "You're on the Forbes 30 Under 30 list. It just dropped, and you made it." We paused recording as my team gathered around my phone, scrolling through the official announcement. There it was, my name and photo alongside media innovators from companies 10 times our size. The citation praised Detoured for reimagining career content for a generation, rejecting traditional paths, and highlighted our rapid growth and engaged community. The validation was overwhelming. This wasn't just a subjective win, it was recognition from a source that spoke my parents' language. For the first time, my success had been translated into terms they might actually understand. My team insisted on champagne and an impromptu celebration in the studio. Congratulatory messages flooded in from listeners, podcast industry colleagues, and former consulting coworkers. Multiple media outlets requested interviews, and our subscriber numbers jumped noticeably within hours of the announcement. Amidst the celebration, one notification stood out. A text from my mother: "Just saw the Forbes list. Call us when you have a moment." Just that. No congratulations. No expression of pride. Just a request for contact after months of near silence. I showed my phone to my research assistant, Maya, who had become something of a confidant regarding my family situation. "That's it. After you made Forbes," she looked incredulous. "Are you going to call them?" "Not today," I decided, slipping my phone back into my pocket. Today is for celebrating with the people who believed in Detoured from the beginning. We extended our celebration into dinner at a nearby restaurant where I found myself surrounded by the team that had helped build my vision and friends who had supported me when my own family wouldn't. The contrast wasn't lost on me. These people, some of whom I'd known for less than a year, showed up for my success in ways my parents never had. By the time I returned to my apartment, slightly tipsy from champagne and emotionally exhausted from the day's highs, 3 more texts had arrived from my parents. "Mom, 4:15 p.m. We're very proud of you, sweetheart. Forbes is quite an achievement." "Dad, 6:30 p.m. Your grandfather would have been impressed. The Morgan name in Forbes. Call us." "Mom, 9:10 p.m. Ainsley, please call. We'd like to take you to dinner to celebrate." The sudden shift in tone was jarring after months of dismissal. Pride, celebration, the recognition of my achievement as something that honored rather than tarnished the family name. I sat on my couch, staring at the messages, unsure whether to laugh or cry. I eventually texted back a simple thanks. "It's been a big day. We'll call tomorrow." Sleep eluded me that night as I wrestled with conflicting emotions. Part of me craved their approval and validation, the wounded child, still seeking parental pride. Another part felt righteous anger at their sudden interest, only after external validation from a source they respected. And underneath it all lay a question I couldn't shake. What did I actually want from this relationship going forward? My thoughts kept returning to the countless stories I'd featured on Detoured, people who had found the courage to redefine success on their own terms, often against family pressure. I had become an advocate for authentic career choices, a voice encouraging others to trust their own definitions of fulfillment. Yet here I was, still vulnerable to my parents' approval. The next morning, I called them before heading to the studio. My mother answered immediately, her voice warmer than I'd heard in months. "Ainsley, we've been waiting for your call. Congratulations, darling. Forbes 30 Under 30. It's incredible." "Thank you," I replied, cautious but civil. "It was quite a surprise. Your father is here too." "We're so proud, aren't we, Richard?" I heard my father's voice in the background. "Put her on speaker." Then more directly, "Ainsley, this is remarkable. I've already heard from 3 colleagues who saw your name." The Forbes list carries significant weight in professional circles. The translation wasn't hard to decode. Now that other people they respected had validated my work, they could finally acknowledge it too. "We'd like to take you to dinner tonight," my mother continued enthusiastically. Your choice of restaurant. A proper celebration for our successful daughter. The offer hung in the air as I considered my response. 8 months earlier, they couldn't be bothered to attend my launch event. Now, they wanted a celebration dinner that would undoubtedly include the same social circle they'd been telling I was going through a career phase. Actually, I said slowly, we're in the middle of production week and I have commitments with my team, but I'd be open to dinner next week. A slight pause. Oh. Well, of course you're busy. That's wonderful. Next week then. And I continued, emboldened by something I couldn't quite name. I'd like to invite you to tour our studio first. See what we've built before we celebrate it. Another pause. My father cleared his throat. That sounds interesting. We'd be happy to see your operation. Great. Tuesday at 4, you can meet the team and see a recording, and then we can go to dinner after. We finalized the plans, and I ended the call feeling strangely powerful. For the first time, I was setting the terms of our engagement. They would see my world on my timeline, not swoop in for a celebratory dinner that bypassed the actual work behind the achievement. As I headed to the studio, my phone rang again, this time a number I didn't recognize. The voice on the other end introduced himself as a producer from the Today Show. We're doing a segment on entrepreneurs disrupting traditional industries, and we'd love to feature you and Detoured. Your Forbes recognition and unique story about leaving consulting to build a podcast network focused on career transitions is exactly what we're looking for. I scheduled the interview for the following week after my parents' visit. As I hung up, a realization dawned on me: the Today Show interview would air nationally. My parents' social circle, the audience they had always performed for, would see it. The Forbes list might have gotten their attention, but national television would make it impossible for them to downplay my career choice in their circles again. The turning point wasn't just about professional validation, it was about a fundamental shift in the power dynamic that had defined our relationship my entire life. I was no longer the daughter seeking approval, but a successful entrepreneur whose story was compelling enough for national media. The parents who couldn't make time for my launch were now making time to visit my studio, and for the first time, I wasn't eager to accommodate their schedule. If you've ever had someone who only showed interest in your success after others validated it, you know exactly how complicated that feeling is. The sweetest victory sometimes comes with the most bittersweet realization that the people who should have believed in you first only came around when everyone else already did. But here's where my story takes an unexpected turn, one that forced me to confront not just my relationship with my parents, but with success itself. The Tuesday of my parents' scheduled visit arrived with unexpected anxiety. I had given my team a heads up about their coming, sharing enough of our complicated history that they understood the significance without making the atmosphere unnecessarily tense. Still, as 4 p.m. approached, I found myself obsessively straightening items in the studio, checking and rechecking the episode outline for the recording they would witness, and changing my outfit twice. You know, for someone who claims to be over-seeking their approval, "You're sure acting like this is a performance review," Maya commented wryly as she watched me rearrange the same stack of research materials for the third time. She was right, of course. Despite all my progress, part of me was still that achievement-oriented child, desperate for a gold star. I took a deep breath and forced my hands to stop fidgeting. "Thanks for the reality check," I admitted. Old habits. At precisely 4:05 p.m., my parents were never late. The studio door opened, and there they stood, looking simultaneously familiar and out of place. My mother wore her standard professional event outfit, a tasteful street John knit suit that probably cost more than our monthly studio rent. My father, ever the corporate lawyer, arrived in a tailored charcoal suit, despite the casual creative atmosphere of our workspace. Ainsley, my mother stepped forward, first embracing me with the careful hug of someone trying not to wrinkle either party's clothing. This is interesting space. Her eyes darted around, taking in the exposed brick walls covered in sound-absorbing panels, the collection of microphones and recording equipment, and the comfortable interview area we'd designed to help guests feel at ease. "Welcome to Detoured Media," I said, stepping back to gesture around the studio. "This is where we record all 3 of our podcast series and create content for our YouTube channel." 3 series. My father raised an eyebrow, the first hint that perhaps they hadn't actually been following my work despite their newfound enthusiasm. Yes, I maintained my professional demeanor. "We've expanded significantly since I launched. Let me introduce you to the team." I led them through the studio, introducing my small but dedicated staff. Maya, our research director who helped develop episode concepts and prepared briefings on guests. Zach, our audio engineer who ensured our sound quality rivaled major productions. Jasmine, who managed our social media presence and community engagement. And Diego, our newest hire, who coordinated sponsorships and partnerships. Each team member politely shook my parents' hands, offering brief explanations of their roles. I noticed my father's expression shift slightly when Diego mentioned the 6-figure deals he was currently negotiating with major brands. "You have employees," my mother observed, as if this fact fundamentally changed her understanding of my venture. "Real employees on payroll. 5 full-time and 3 regular contractors," I confirmed. "We've been profitable for the past 4 months. My father looked around with new interest. "And this is all from advertising revenue. Advertising is about 60% of our income. We also have a premium membership program, speaking engagements, and licensing deals for our content." I guided them toward the recording area. "We're about to record a segment for tomorrow's episode. I thought you might like to observe the process." We had deliberately scheduled one of our most impressive guests for today's recording, a former Fortune 500 CFO who had left her position to start a financial literacy program for underserved communities. Her story perfectly encapsulated the Detoured ethos, and her corporate background would resonate with my parents' values while challenging their assumptions. As we settled in for the recording with my parents seated quietly behind the glass partition of our sound booth, I felt an unexpected calm replace my earlier anxiety. This was my domain where I asked the questions and guided the conversation. Here I was, confident and capable in ways that had nothing to do with the Morgan family expectations. The interview flowed beautifully. Our guest was articulate about both her previous corporate success and her current mission, weaving a compelling narrative about redefining impact and legacy. From my peripheral vision, I could see my parents leaning forward, genuinely engaged by the conversation. When we finished recording, my father's first question surprised me. "How many people will hear this interview?" "This episode will probably reach about 1,200,000 listeners in the first week," I answered. "Plus the YouTube audience for the video version." He blinked, absorbing this information. "That's substantial reach. More people than will ever read one of my legal briefs," he added, with what almost sounded like admiration. We transitioned to dinner at an upscale restaurant nearby, the kind my parents typically preferred. As we settled in with menus, I noticed a shift in their demeanor, a tentative respect that hadn't been present before. "The Forbes recognition is well-deserved," my mother offered once we had ordered. "Your studio is quite professional, and your team seems very capable." "Thank you," I replied simply. "We may have been hasty in our assessment of your career change," my father added, studying his water glass intently. "The media landscape has clearly evolved since our day." I set down my fork, years of suppressed frustration suddenly crystallizing into clarity. "It's not about the media landscape evolving. It's about the fact that you never bothered to understand what I was building because it didn't fit your predetermined definition of success. My mother's expression tightened. Ainsley, we're trying to extend an olive branch here. Are you? Because it sounds more like you're finally acknowledging my work now that Forbes has deemed it worthy. Where was this support when I invited you to my launch event? When I was working 18-hour days to build something from nothing, when I needed my parents' encouragement most, my father's jaw clenched, a familiar sign of his displeasure. We've always supported your success. No, I interrupted, something I rarely dared to do. You've always supported your vision of my success. There's a critical difference. The waiter approached with our appetizers, sensed the tension, and quickly retreated after setting down the plates. We were concerned, my mother defended. Walking away from a prestigious position for an uncertain venture isn't something parents encourage lightly. Concern would have been asking questions, offering advice, maybe expressing reservations while still showing up for me. What you did was dismissal. You didn't attend my launch because podcasts aren't real careers, but now that Forbes has validated me, suddenly you're proud. My father set his napkin down firmly. That's unfair, Ainsley. We've always wanted what's best for you. What you've always wanted is for me to follow the Morgan blueprint for success, I countered. When I created my own, you couldn't even be bothered to show up. We're here now, my mother said quietly. Isn't that what matters? Why are you here, though? Because you genuinely want to understand the work I'm passionate about, or because Forbes made it socially acceptable to acknowledge my career choice to your friends? The question hung in the air between us. My father shifted uncomfortably in his seat before answering with unexpected candor. Both, if we're being completely honest. We didn't understand this podcast venture, and yes, the Forbes recognition made us realize we might have misjudged its legitimacy. He met my gaze directly. But we're also here because you're our daughter, and this estrangement has been difficult. Richard, my mother touched his arm, surprised by his admission. No, Eleanor, she deserves honesty. He turned back to me. We were wrong not to support your choice, even if we didn't understand it. The success you've built is undeniable, and it's time we acknowledged that. His admission stunned me into momentary silence. In all my years, I had rarely heard my father concede error so directly. I appreciate that, I finally said. But I need you to understand something fundamental. My worth isn't determined by a Forbes list. I was building something valuable before they recognized it, and I'll continue to do so regardless of external validation. My mother reached across the table to take my hand. We're beginning to see that now. Your guest today, the former CFO, she was fascinating. I found myself rethinking some of my own assumptions about career fulfillment. That's the entire point of Detoured, I explained, feeling a small thaw in my resolve. It's about challenging the narrative that there's only one path to meaningful work, including the Morgan family path, my father acknowledged with a hint of a smile. Though I maintain there's nothing wrong with law school. The tension eased slightly as we continued our meal, the conversation shifting to more neutral ground, the logistics of podcast production, the business model, my vision for expansion. They were asking real questions, not merely waiting for their chance to redirect me toward their preferred path. As dessert arrived, my mother broached the subject that clearly had been on her mind. So, the Today Show. That's quite something. News travels fast, I observed, wondering how they'd heard about the interview scheduled for later that week. Caroline Mitchell's daughter works in television. She mentioned seeing your name on the production schedule. Of course, my parents' social network extending its reach as usual. We'll be sure to watch. The whole family will. The implication was clear. The social circle that had heard about my hobby would now see my success broadcast nationally. The Forbes list had been a private victory. The Today Show appearance would be a public one. You know, my father said, setting down his espresso cup, your grandfather walked away from a lucrative banking career to start his law practice when everyone told him he was making a mistake. The Morgans have a history of redefining success on their own terms. I had forgotten that tradition. It was as close to a full endorsement as I was likely to get, connecting my choices to the family legacy, rather than viewing them as a rejection of it. Progress, however, belated. We parted that evening with tentative plans for them to attend our upcoming live recording event, a far cry from the launch they had skipped. The relationship remained fragile, a delicate reconstruction of trust that would take more than one dinner to solidify. As I walked home after dinner, I reflected on the complicated victory of the day. I had finally gained my parents' recognition, but on my own terms. By succeeding so visibly they couldn't ignore it, by forcing them to come to my world, rather than abandoning mine for theirs. The real victory wasn't the Forbes list, or even their changed perspective. It was in discovering that their approval so long, the currency I had traded in, was no longer the measure of my worth. I had built something meaningful, without it surrounded myself with people who believed in my vision from the start, and found fulfillment that existed independently of the Morgan family blueprint. The following week, my Today Show interview aired to my largest audience yet. Viewer emails flooded in, many from people inspired to pursue their own career detours. My parents sent flowers to the studio with a card that read simply, "Proud of you. We're listening now." They had missed the beginning of my journey, but perhaps they could be part of its continuation. On my terms, in my world, a world I had built when no one else, especially those who should have supported me most, believed I could. The 3 months following my parents' studio visit brought changes I couldn't have anticipated. The Today Show appearance generated a surge in listenership that necessitated expanding our team and operations. Detoured Media was no longer just a podcast network, but a growing brand with merchandising deals, a book contract, and inquiries about television adaptation. Most surprisingly, my parents began making genuine efforts to understand and participate in my world. My father, ever the analytical one, started listening to all 3 podcast series, sending detailed emails with observations about interview techniques and content suggestions. My mother, meanwhile, appointed herself an unofficial ambassador, proudly mentioning my daughter, the media entrepreneur, at every social function. Their support, while appreciated, sometimes felt like overcompensation for their earlier dismissal. I maintained a cautious distance, uncertain whether their change of heart was genuine evolution or merely a response to public validation. The real test came unexpectedly on a Thursday afternoon, when my assistant transferred a call from Yale University's School of Management. The dean's office was organizing a panel on entrepreneurship and new media, and wanted me as a featured speaker alongside several established business leaders. "We'd like you to discuss your transition from consulting to creating Detoured Media," the program coordinator explained. "Your Forbes recognition and your unique perspective on career pivots make you ideal for this conversation." The irony wasn't lost on me being invited back to the very institution that had been central to my parents' vision for my proper career path now, to speak about the unconventional route I'd chosen instead. "The panel is scheduled for May 15th, she continued. "We'll handle your travel arrangements and accommodations." May 15th? The date immediately registered. It was my parents' 35th wedding anniversary. They had mentioned their plans for a celebration dinner during our last conversation. After confirming my participation, I sat contemplating whether to mention the timing conflict to them. Part of me, the part still healing from their absence at my launch, considered keeping the Yale invitation to myself. They had missed my milestone. Perhaps it was fitting that I miss their anniversary dinner for a career opportunity. But that thought felt small, a perpetuation of the very dynamic I was trying to evolve beyond. After a moment's consideration, I called my mother. Yale wants me to speak on an entrepreneurship panel, I explained after exchanging pleasantries. But it's scheduled for your anniversary. I wanted to check before confirming my travel plans. The line went quiet momentarily. "Oh, Ainsley," she finally said, her voice softening. "That's a wonderful opportunity. Yale's business school has such influence." "Yes, but it's your anniversary dinner." "I know you and Dad have reservations at Le Bernardin. Dinner can be rescheduled," she said firmly. "This is important for your career. We wouldn't want you to miss it." The contrast with their previous attitude couldn't have been starker. 8 months earlier, they had skipped my launch for a casual fundraiser. Now they were willing to postpone their anniversary celebration for my speaking engagement. "Actually," she continued, "your father and I were thinking, perhaps we could come to New Haven that weekend. Attend your panel, and then have a celebration dinner afterward. Make it a family weekend." The invitation, their first proactive suggestion to participate in my professional world, caught me off guard. "You want to attend the panel?" "Of course. We'd love to hear you speak." She paused. "We're trying, Ainsley. We may have been late to understand your path, but we're sincere in supporting it now." Skepticism and hope warred within me. "I'd like that," I finally said, choosing to accept the olive branch for what it was, an imperfect but genuine attempt at reconciliation. The weeks leading up to the Yale panel were among Daytoward Media's busiest yet. We launched a 4th podcast series, hired 3 new team members, and finalized details for a live tour in major cities. Through it all, my parents stayed engaged, requesting regular updates and offering to help however they could, a dramatic reversal from their earlier dismissal. When the weekend of the Yale panel arrived, I flew to New Haven a day early to prepare, checking into the same hotel where my parents would be staying. That evening alone, in my room reviewing my presentation notes, I received a text from my father. "Just landed. Are you free for a nightcap in the hotel bar?" I found him seated alone in a quiet corner, looking older somehow than when I'd last seen him, or perhaps I was just seeing him more clearly now. "Where's Mom?" I asked, sliding into the seat across from him. "She's taking a call from her practice partner. She'll join us shortly." He signaled the server for my drink order, then leaned forward. "I wanted a moment to speak with you privately before tomorrow." My guard instantly rose. Was this going to be last-minute advice on how to represent the Morgan name properly? "Ainsley," he began, his voice uncharacteristically hesitant, "I owe you an apology that's long overdue. A real one, not the qualified acknowledgement I gave at dinner months ago." I remained silent, giving him space to continue. "When you left consulting, I genuinely believed you were making a mistake. Not because podcasting isn't a legitimate field, but because the path you were choosing seemed so much harder than the one laid out for you." He turned his tumbler slowly between his fingers. "I wanted to protect you from struggle, from failure. What I failed to understand was that the greatest disservice I could do was to prevent you from finding your own way. Dad." He raised a hand gently. "Please let me finish. What I've come to realize watching you build Detoured is that you weren't rejecting the values we raised you with. Excellence, dedication, innovation. You've applied all of those principles just in a field we didn't anticipate." His eyes met mine directly. "I'm not proud of how we handled your career transition. But I am immeasurably proud of what you've built, despite our lack of support." The sincerity in his voice, so different from the performative pride after the Forbes recognition, broke something open in me. "Thank you," I said quietly. "That means more than you know." Tomorrow, when you speak at Yale, you'll be addressing students at a crossroads similar to the one you faced. Some will follow conventional paths, others will forge new ones. What I hope they take from your story is the courage to define success on their own terms. He smiled slightly. And perhaps more importantly, what I hope parents in the audience learn is to support their children's journeys, especially when those journeys diverge from expectations. My mother joined us, then bringing her characteristic energy to the conversation. But the private moment with my father had shifted something fundamental in our relationship, a genuine acknowledgement of autonomous personhood that had been missing in all our previous interactions. The next morning, as I prepared to take the stage for the panel discussion, I spotted my parents in the third row. Not front and center, drawing attention to themselves, but present and attentive. My father gave a subtle nod of encouragement as I was introduced. The moderator began with a question about my transition from consulting to media entrepreneurship. As I shared the story, including an honest account of the lack of support I initially faced, I noticed my parents listening intently without visible discomfort at this public acknowledgement of our complicated history. The core message of Detoured has always been that success isn't a single predefined path, I explained to the audience. Sometimes the most meaningful work comes from having the courage to disappoint the people whose approval we most desire in service of our authentic calling. During the Q&A portion, a student asked about managing family expectations while pursuing unconventional career paths. As I formulated my response, I caught my father's eye. Family relationships are complex, I began carefully. Sometimes those closest to us resist our choices out of genuine concern rather than a desire to control. The challenge is maintaining your conviction while leaving space for perspectives to evolve, including your own. After the panel concluded to enthusiastic applause, my parents waited patiently as I spoke with students and fellow panelists. When we finally connected, my mother embraced me with uncharacteristic public emotion. "You were magnificent," she whispered. "So articulate, so assured." My father, more reserved but equally moved, simply said, "You've found your voice. In every sense." We walked together across the campus toward the restaurant, where we'd celebrate both their anniversary and my successful panel appearance. As we passed the economics building where I'd spent countless hours as an undergraduate following the path they'd envisioned for me, my father paused. "Your grandfather used to say that legacy isn't what you leave for people, it's what you leave in them," he reflected. I always interpreted that as financial security professional standing. But watching you today, I understand he meant something far more profound. "What's that?" I asked. "The courage to trust your own compass." He smiled. "The true Morgan legacy isn't law or consulting or even podcasting. It's the willingness to chart your own course with integrity." That evening, over dinner, we talked about the future of Detoured Media, with a sense of shared investment I'd never experienced with them before. My mother suggested potential guests from her medical network, while my father offered insights on business expansion. For the first time, it felt like genuine collaboration rather than attempted redirection. When they proposed a toast to my success, I raised my glass with a modified suggestion to finding our way separately and together. The journey from estrangement to reconciliation wasn't complete and perhaps never would be entirely. Old patterns had a way of reasserting themselves, and genuine change required constant vigilance. But something fundamental had shifted in our family dynamic. My parents had finally recognized that supporting me meant supporting my chosen path, not just the destination they had predetermined. And I had learned that true independence wasn't about rejection of family values, but their thoughtful reinterpretation for a different world. As we finished dinner and stepped out into the New Haven evening, my mother linked her arm through mine. "Your next podcast series," she said casually, "have you considered focusing on family relationships across generations? How values evolve while maintaining connection?" I laughed, genuinely surprised by her insight. "Actually, that's been on our concept board for months. We're calling it Inherited Evolving Family Legacies." "I'd listen to that," my father said, joining us. "I might even have a story or two to contribute." The offer to participate in my world rather than just observe it from a distance represented everything I had originally hoped for when I launched Detoured. Not approval based on external validation, but genuine engagement with the work itself. The reconciliation wasn't perfect. There would still be moments of misunderstanding, old habits resurfacing on both sides. But walking between my parents that evening, I realized we had all in our own ways detoured from our original positions to find a new shared path, one that honored both their legacy and my autonomy. 1 year to the day after my parents skipped my podcast launch, I stood in the wings of a sold-out theater in Manhattan preparing to record the milestone 100th episode of Detoured the Conversations. The audience of 1200 people included loyal listeners, media industry figures, and in the front row, my parents. The journey from that initial rejection to this moment of triumph contained more plot twists than I could have imagined. The estrangement, the Forbes recognition, the Today Show appearance, and most significantly, the gradual, sometimes awkward, rebuilding of family relationships on new terms. Detoured Media had expanded beyond my wildest expectations. With a staff of 5 distinct podcast series, a best-selling book based on our most compelling stories, and a documentary in pre-production. The company that had begun in my bedroom closet now occupied a full floor in a Brooklyn office building. As I was introduced and walked onto the stage to enthusiastic applause, I caught my mother discreetly wiping away a tear. My father sat beside her, his usual reserve softened by unmistakable pride. Not the conditional approval of before, but genuine appreciation for the path I had forged. The milestone episode featured a panel of guests from our most popular episodes, each sharing how their career detours had transformed their lives. When it came time for audience questions, the first came from a young woman in her early 20s. My parents don't support my decision to leave medical school for documentary filmmaking, she said, her voice shaking slightly. They're threatening to cut financial support. How did you find the courage to persist when the people who should support you most don't believe in your vision? I took a moment before responding, glancing briefly at my parents. The hardest lesson I've learned is that sometimes you have to be willing to disappoint the people you love most in order to be true to yourself. But what I've also discovered is that relationships can evolve, perspectives can shift, and sometimes the very people who initially reject your path can become your strongest advocates. As the event concluded and we moved to the reception area, my father approached with 2 glasses of champagne. For the media mogul, he said, handing me one with a genuine smile. Your grandfather would have been amazed by what you've built, not just the business, but the community around it, the impact you're having. I've been thinking about him a lot lately, I admitted, about legacy and how it transforms across generations. My mother joined us, sliding her arm through my father's. Speaking of transformation, she said, we have something to share. My father nodded. We've established the Morgan Family Foundation for New Media Entrepreneurs, a grant program for innovative digital media projects with a focus on career development content. I nearly choked on my champagne. You're funding podcasters. My mother laughed. Well, we've learned a thing or two about the legitimacy of the field. The foundation will provide seed funding and mentorship for projects that might otherwise never get off the ground. And my father added with uncharacteristic hesitation, we were hoping you might serve on the selection committee. Help us identify voices that deserve to be amplified. The symmetry was almost too perfect. The parents who had once dismissed my media career now creating opportunities for others to follow similar paths with my guidance. It represented everything I had built. Detoured to champion the validation of unconventional career choices, the evolution of success, definitions across generations, the creation of new pathways. I'd be honored, I said, simply raising my glass to them. To new beginnings. As we clinked glasses, I reflected on the journey that had brought us here. The parents who skipped my launch because podcasts weren't real, careers were now establishing a foundation to support podcast creators. The daughter who had once measured her worth by their approval had built a successful media company by trusting her own vision instead. We had all in our ways detoured from our original positions to find a new understanding, not perfect, still evolving, but authentic in a way our previous relationship had never been. The greatest revenge against those who doubt your path isn't proving them wrong. It's creating such undeniable value that they're inspired to join your journey rather than obstruct it. I looked around the reception at my team, my listeners, my family, all part of the community that had formed around a simple idea that success comes in many forms, often where we least expect to find it. In the end, my parents hadn't just recognized my success. They had expanded their own definition of what success could be. And that perhaps was the most meaningful victory of all. So, what about you? Have you ever had a moment where someone who doubted you suddenly wanted to be part of your success story? Or have you been on the other side having to admit you misjudged someone's path? I'd love to hear your family karma stories in the comments. If this resonated with you, please hit that like button, subscribe to hear more real-life justice stories, and share this with someone who might need a reminder that sometimes the best revenge is massive success. Thank you for joining me for this deeply personal story. And remember, sometimes the most important life lessons come from the people who challenge us the most. Until next time.